Lando Norris' latest win came with a massive statement over Verstappen. The fight for the Drivers' Championship is all but over, and with 70 points separating these two drivers, as well as 9 races with 3 sprint venues, it's game on. However, the deficit does seem a bit high for Norris to overcome, as no driver has ever done so in the history of the sport with such a great following margin. But with McLaren's dominance in Zandvoort being way too obvious, could Norris present us with a 2021-like season? And if so, how can the stars align for the maiden championship of the Brit? It's safe to say that McLaren is entering every race right now as the clear favourite, regardless of the nature of the track. And this is the first thing that we must say about this video, because it's something that Norris can count on for the last 9 races in 2024. Whether it's a street circuit like Baku and Singapore or a low downforce one like Monza, it shouldn't be too big of a problem for McLaren, given that they've dunked a 21-second lead on Verstappen's home race, and had they not botched the strategy for Piastri, it could have been an even greater embarrassment for Red Bull, who seem to have lost their way in the mid-season development. This is the factor that McLaren has and Red Bull doesn't: working upgrades. Before Zandvoort, Helmut Marko stated that it seems like the upgrades they brought to the team, with the greater emphasis being put on Hungary, do seem a lot more like downgrades to the car, which was the primary reason they moved back to the Bahrain spec floor for the Zandvoort circuit. And if we're to look at the results, they say it all. Verstappen is now a lone wolf in between 2 McLaren drivers, potentially 2 Mercedes drivers if they manage to figure out the struggles, and occasionally a Ferrari contender in the name of Leclerc or Sainz. On the other hand, McLaren's woes do not seem nearly as strong as the ones of Red Bull, because in Hungary we've listened to a radio message that was very loud and clear. Norris would need his teammates' help in the fight for the championship. Therefore, a battle between these two is unlikely to happen in the remainder of the 9 races if Norris continues with this great performance like in Zandvoort. And Jos Verstappen has been adamant that Red Bull needs to do something quick in order to provide the best possible machinery to his son in the quest for the 4th championship. As the father of Max went on to say, "McLaren is going like a rocket. We are doing everything we can to close the gap, but we haven't succeeded yet. I also saw this coming a bit. The updates are there, but don't do much. Red Bull has to pull out all the stops to improve. The title in the Drivers' Championship is not a certainty. You never have certainties. Max is doing everything he can to score as many points as possible, but it's not a certainty." On the other hand, Helmut Marko was not very optimistic about what is coming to Red Bull, and while he did mention that upgrades are well on their way, the pace that the MCL 38 had today was unmatchable from not just Verstappen, but anyone on the grid. With such a performance of Norris, it was quite hard to understand why Piastri wasn't second, but with a poor strategy as well as the car not behaving as it should in dirty air, Red Bull could learn a lot about the Achilles heel of McLaren and maybe use Verstappen's knowledge in turning it against the Woking-based squad, as they do not have a lot of hope that Perez can be a factor in the Drivers' Championship quest for his teammate. Adding to the remainder of the 2024 season, Marko said, "Norris now has the speed to catch Max in the championship. We have to find something. There is something in the pipeline, but McLaren is very fast." Red Bull have definitely aggravated Verstappen with the downgrades, and according to Viaplay, when they were escorting Verstappen to the podium, he said that he is not happy with the car's behaviour and there will be a lot to talk about after this race. It implies that he will have to drive 120% of himself in order to keep this lead of 70 points in his hands. But if we're to look at the remainder of the calendar, finishing P2 for Verstappen would be much harder than finishing P1 for Norris. So the gap of 70 points should narrow down quite quickly in the next 3 races in Monza, Baku and Singapore. Apart from these 3, we have 6 more to visit, which means that in a best case scenario for McLaren and Red Bull, the 1-2 finish of Zandvoort is repeated 9 more times, excluding sprint races, and that would result in Norris being just 7 points behind Verstappen in the Drivers' Championship. Even if we are to add 3 more sprint wins for Norris and P2 finishes for Verstappen, that would be be a hurtful 4-point difference in the favour of the Dutchman. However, to predict this is very far-fetched, and quite frankly, given how McLaren has dominated Zandvoort, it's more likely that Piastri would have a higher possibility of finishing P2 in many of these races than Verstappen, which would put the Dutchman in a very difficult position to defend the championship. The downfall of Red Bull is definitely present, and even Horner admitted that adding downforce to the car might not have been the best thing to do in terms of following the right path of development of the RB20. There is the internal power struggle, of course, as well as the departure of Newey and Wheatley that they have to deal with, and all in all, 2024 is shaping up to be a very interesting and rather competitive season for McLaren and Red Bull. But as I mentioned earlier in the video, Norris would need a lot more than 10 consecutive race wins and 3 sprint race wins in order to win the championship. He would need the help of his teammate. Of course, we can talk about how that same teammate stole 7 points from him in Hungary due to a team play, but that's irrelevant now that the race is in the past. Norris has also made a lot of mistakes in tracks in which he should have cut down the lead to Verstappen, with Canada, Spain, Britain and Spa being the most obvious ones. What is worth mentioning is that had Norris done everything the way he should have, the gap to Verstappen would be more around the 40-point gap. But again, this is where the Verstappen factor counts in, and this is where the championships come to light, as the entire team was on fire in events like Silverstone, where Verstappen was poised to finish P5 or P6, judging by the first half of the race, but ended up P2 and close to a P1 fight with Hamilton due to a proper strategy. This is something that McLaren needs to work on, because leaving Piastri too late has enabled Leclerc to pull an undercut move to both him and Russell, and while Piastri was able to get past Russell, he wasn't able to complete a pass on the Monegasque driver and try to hunt down Verstappen to aid his teammate with 3 more points in the Drivers' Championship. While the Constructors are now a question of when, not if, for McLaren, as they've shed down 12 more points from Red Bull and are just 30 points behind the Milton Keynes base squad, Zandvoort has opened up their eyes about a potential fight in the Drivers' Championship, which can be enabled by the fact that McLaren has produced a car that delivers deathly precise and ultra-fast performance everywhere the caravan is going. While this opens up the 2024 season entirely and gives us the opportunity to watch the most interesting campaign ever since the 2021 nail-biting end between Hamilton and Verstappen, it's also a huge indicator for the future. 2025 couldn't come sooner, and it's now very obvious that Red Bull will have a massive deficit compared to where they used to start the seasons during the newly regulated era, when Verstappen dunked around 50 seconds of advantage compared to Norris in the first race in Bahrain in 2024. 13 races later, and Norris managed to finish a race on pure pace 21 seconds ahead of Verstappen, which just goes to show that McLaren might be the only team on the grid that is able to add performances on the car and make them work, as every other squad on the grid has struggled with the synchronization of the upgrades and the car's performance. The biggest question that Red Bull would have to answer to themselves is whether or not they have enough to keep Verstappen at bay, because a competitive driver like him wouldn't be very happy in a toxic and non-working environment like the one that's currently ravaging Red Bull. With all this in mind, though, it would be interesting to see whether teams like Mercedes and Aston Martin would appear to be interesting enough for Verstappen's next step in his career, as it's now inevitable that Red Bull are far away from the fastest team on the grid, and if this downslope continues, it would bring much worse things to the squad. So, do you think that Norris has what it takes to win his maiden championship in the last 9 races of the season? And if so, would you label this as the greatest comeback in the history of the sport? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and once you do that, check out the video that's appearing on your screen right now.